Alright gamers, today we're going to cover how to build every single ADC in Season 14. Let's just go ahead and get started. For Caitlyn, there's two different main builds you want to be using at the moment. The main one is Stormrazor into Infinity Edge, and then usually following up with Fire Cannon or Bloodthirster or Dominix, you know, just the usual situational items. And then the second build that you can use is Stormrazor into Collector into Infinity Edge, and this is basically just the same build but with a faster power spike with the Collector, since Infinity Edge at 2 items is still not very strong since you'd have too much crit. So you get a faster power spike with Collector, but overall skills worse in the build and delays the rest of your power spikes, but it's a perfectly good option. Might even be the best build, might not be. Up to you what you prefer to run there. So unfortunately, as best as I can tell, Ezreal just sucks this season because they changed Serylda's, which is a core item on him, to give less armor pen if you're not building lethality, which he usually doesn't with his Triforce build, his main build. And abilities no longer slow at all times. They only slow to enemies that are below 50% HP. So that's another big hit for Ezreal, who could otherwise just perma-slow at all times. It does at least give 15 lethality, but I think it did also lose some ability haste, so pretty bad changes for Ezreal overall. And probably makes him quite bad. His win rate definitely did drop. It's possible that people still need to learn his itemization and maybe stuff like Volt Take, which so far looks promising, but you know, it's early season, like early days data, possibly inflated by being fed when he builds it. I don't know. Possibly items like these will actually turn out to be really strong on him and make him actually in a good state, but as far as I can tell, probably for now the best I can tell is just you should probably still do Serylda's, but it's just much worse. And the usual items like Ravenous Hydra, Spear of Shojin, Black Laver, Frozen Heart, Maw, anything like this is still viable. Basically same builds as before, he's just worse now. For Kaisa, it seems that there's 3 different viable builds right now. There's on-hit, AP, and just the standard crit. The on-hit build that I recommend at the moment is Kraken Ginsu's Terminus or Kraken Terminus Ginsu's. I don't know if there's going to be really much of a difference, both seem pretty good on her. You can follow that up with a fourth item, Runans or Witsand or whatever you need for the situation. Then the AP build would be Stormrazor into Ginsu's into Nashor's Tooth. And then you follow it up with other AP items. It seems that Storm Surge could be very, very good this season, or at least this patch, not just on Kaisa in general, but not just in Kaisa, sorry, but with AP champions and mages in general. Whenever you hit your W on a target, that should probably usually deal about 35% of their HP, so you probably get movement speed every time you hit W. If it doesn't do quite that much, that's fine. You still at least get that movement speed whenever you're really in combat with a champion, because you're almost certainly going to be doing 35% of their HP. So that's really good for mobility and should be quite decent damage as well. And then that covers the AP build. Obviously, your situational choices there are just the AP items in general. There's not much to cover there. And then the crit build is just the usual Kraken Slayer into Navori into Phantom Dancer with just regular crit item choices from there, like Lord Dominix, Bloodthirster, etc. For Lucian, there's also, once again, just 2 different viable builds at the moment, it seems. Basically full crit or crit lethality, just like Jhin. The crit build is going to be Kraken Slayer into Navori Quick Blades into Fire Cannon, and then with other just regular ADC items. And the crit build is going to be Youmuu's with Kraken Slayer into Fire Cannon or Navori, and then following it up with whichever item you didn't build. So something like this. And then obviously you're just transitioning into other crit items, so Lord Dominix, for example, Bloodthirster. You might even need to do Lord Dominix 3rd or 4th, maybe even before Navori. This build is going to spike a lot faster just because the Youmuu's is so busted right now. I'll actually cover that. I'll cover it now. I should have probably mentioned it with Jhin, but Youmuu's is just really strong right now because they kept the same amount of AD and lethality that it had before. They actually removed the ability haste. This tooltip is out of date. So basically you just spend the same amount of gold for the same amount of damage as you did before. No, sorry, less gold for the same amount of damage as you did before, which makes it such an insane power spike in lane where you're getting that damage before anybody else has completed their item. So you gain just a huge power spike in lane, and that is why this build seems to be viable right now. There's going to be a few ADC builds we'll cover where it's just rushing Youmuu's and otherwise just building into crit, because that ADC didn't necessarily want the full lethality build. They do want to build crit, but the Youmuu's is just strong enough to justify building as a first item right now. For Jhin, we basically have the choices of crit build or crit lethality build. Crit build is the better scaling build. Crit lethality has a stronger early spike, but transition to crit to not scale terribly, but still not as well as the regular crit build, which builds only crit items. The regular crit build is just the regular old Stormrazor into Infinity Edge, into Fire Cannon, into whatever else you need. And then the lethality build that I recommend at the moment is Youmuu's into Collector, into Lord Dominik's if you need it, otherwise just Fire Cannon, and then maybe Lord Dominik's or Bloodthirster. No, so you wouldn't really do Bloodthirster before Infinity Edge, but if you don't really need anything like in particular situational, then you can just do Infinity Edge directly after Fire Cannon. And then if you still don't need Lord Dominik's, you could do Bloodthirster, but generally you'd expect your full build to be something like this, including all of these items in whatever order you think would be ideal. This is actually missing Infinity Edge, actually. Yes, no, sorry, you can't actually run all 6 of those, can you? You would actually need to like exclude Bloodthirster for Infinity Edge, or you could get to run Bloodthirster if you really don't need Armor Pen. For Misfortune, it seems like she's basically just using the same build as last season. It's just actually just a lot stronger, both because of the lethality changes, the Youmuu's change, Cyrilda's Grudge change. I suppose it could be good for her, it could be bad. I'm not actually entirely sure, to be honest. She does gain ability haste now instead of CDR, which is better for her. Sorry, she gains lethality now instead of ability haste, which is better for her. She's not too obsessed with ability haste. And she stacks a ton of lethality, so she gains the full value of the armor pen, maybe just a bit scaling. But either way, it's pretty good as a third item, and even though it doesn't slow immediately with her ultimate, she's typically going to get a lot of value out of the slow anyway, because people drop to below half HP so quickly against Misfortune ultimate. There could be other choices that are like pretty good with the new lethality items that maybe you could run something different, but as far as I can tell, this does still seem to be the best 3 item core, so you'd only maybe consider building some of the other lethality items afterwards. Edge of Night is solid, Voltaic thingy might be good, Xayah is good as usual, could even transition a little bit into a crit build with Bloodthirster and Lord Dominik's or Infinity Edge, or you can't do Lord Dominik's, sorry, but with Infinity Edge and Bloodthirster. So yeah. For Jinx, you obviously always just do crit. When you're doing crit, you can either rush the Kraken Slayer or the Stormrazor. This is, the only viable, like, big crit item for Jinx, because Guild Force is removed. There's, Navori was never an option for her. It's still not an option. So, either Kraken Slayer or Stormrazor. And then third item can be Fire Cannon, it can be Runehands, it can be Phantom Dancer, it can be Lord Dominik's, it can be Bloodthirster. It's a little bit based on personal preference, a little bit based on situational stuff. You might want to do Phantom Dancer if you want DPS. You would do Fire Cannon if you want long range poke to deal with targets that you can't really get too close to, like Vladimir, for example. And that's the main build path for crit. There's also just a slight alternative build path, which is just Kraken Slayer into Phantom Dancer into the Infinity Edge. And this just gives you a faster power spike with the Phantom Dancer, and may just be better overall because, as I said, Infinity Edge doesn't actually scale too well at the 2 item point. You still don't have much crit to use it with. So it might just be better to do Phantom Dancer now that there's no more mythic system forcing you to build Infinity Edge earlier. But that will, remains to be seen. For Ashe, there's probably quite a lot of choices right now, but I'm going to try and keep it simple. You can still run the same build as before, Kraken Slayer into Triforce. The difference is that now you can actually run Triforce and Infinity Edge. So instead of going into something like Bork, I would definitely recommend doing either Runehands or Phantom Dancer, and then following that up with an Infinity Edge, or if you need it, Lord Dominik's and then Infinity Edge. I don't feel like there's really any good reason not to build Infinity Edge in the full build overall with the Triforce build on Ashe, since you don't need it, except for the fact, since you can build them together now, sorry. Except for the fact that there is also experimental Hexplate in the game now. This can fit into Ashe's build in quite a few ways. You can either do Kraken Slayer into Triforce into experimental Hexplates, which wouldn't leave too much room for other crit items, so you may as well then transition into other stuff like Bork if you want. And there's also another thing that should probably be quite good, which is just Hexplate Rush into the Triforce. Obviously, Hexplate is quite a strong, on paper just gives amazing stats. It gives 55 AD, 20% attack speed, 300 health, which is already decent. Then you also gain 30 ability haste for your ultimate. Ashe quite loves her ultimate, so that's good. And then after you cast your ultimate, you gain 35% attack speed and 15% bonus movement speed for 8 seconds. Obviously, Ashe's ultimate is pretty much just like the perfect go button. Like if you cast your Ashe ultimate, you are doing something with that afterwards, so it's absolutely perfect for her. So might be good as a first item, maybe it's best as a third item. Maybe there's ways you can slot it in as a second item. I don't know what the optimal thing to do here is, but there's a decent chance that it's going to be optimal on Ashe. But I wouldn't say it's like 100% certain. So you can experiment with that if you want, and let me know how it goes. For Samira, we can just keep it simple. Collector, into Infinity Edge, into Shield Bow. Same build as previous patch, same exact order. Potentially there's other stuff you can do like Opportunity. Seems to be performing well on her right now. But there's not really enough data to really go off of right now, so I wouldn't make any assertions about this. All I know is that the same build as before is very strong, like even stronger actually, just because lethality got buffed. Collector, I would say overall got buffed even aside from the lethality changes. So it's actually quite a strong item to rush right now, and Samira already wanted to rush it, so that's perfect for her. Seems to be just very strong in the current patch, just with the same items as before. Next we have a Vayne. There's a lot, you know, the same builds that used to be viable on Vayne should be viable now, like the standard Static Shiv into Trinity Force, still good. The difference is that because you're not really forced to pick between Triforce and On-Hit anymore, so there's nothing stopping you from doing Triforce into Ginsu's. But at that point, I would say probably Terminus would actually be even better, because it's going to give you all of those resistances. We know Vayne has some synergy with tank items, so this is like a hybrid between full offense and full, well, obviously not full defense, but it does give you some defensive properties, which is especially good with the Triforce to get some resistances to stack up with that. And then after the Terminus, you could then do the Ginsu's, or you could do Ginsu's first if you just want more damage, and then do Terminus. You know, there's a whole lot of options here. I'm not going to give you the exact build you should run, because there's not necessarily one exact build you should run. This is very flexible for Vayne. You can even do Bork, obviously, if you're just facing tanks. You can even just do tank items. You know, there's a whole lot of options. And then we also have the possibility for Hexplate. You can do that directly after Triforce, just like with Ashe. Or just like with Ashe, you could actually do Hexplate Rush into then the Triforce. In theory, you could also do Hexplate into On-Hit. It's probably not amazing though. If you want to do full On-Hit build, you would do something else. We'll cover that in a sec. But either Hexplate Rush into Triforce, or just the standard Triforce build into Hexplate afterwards. Again, Vayne's ultimate is just like a pure go button, so just getting massively buffed up whenever you press ult. Sounds really good on her in theory. This is just theory at the moment though. I haven't tried it. There's not much data on it. This is just something you can try out if you want to, and I imagine it should be good. I can't make any promises, but my guess is that it would be quite good. At the very least viable, competitive with other options. And then we just have, of course, the classic on-hit, pure on-hit build, which is just Bork into Ginsu's, into Terminus. Maybe some other options like Wit's End if you need it, but mainly just this 3-item core. No reason to run anything else, really. Can't really fail you. Then you can just get freaky with it. You can add Wit's End, you can do Experimental Hexplate, you could do Jack Show. You could do, really, again, like she has a very flexible itemization choices, right? So you can do quite a lot of things here. You know, just figure out what you like, what you think is ideal for the situation. I can't really go wrong with it. So Varus is quite similar to Vayne, except he doesn't have the option of the Triforce build. He does have a lethality build, but I don't think it's very good. Both on this patch and previous patches, it's just never had a good win rate, so I personally don't really recommend it for solo queue. So instead we just skip straight on to the on-hit build, which, just like Vayne, is going to be Bork into Ginsu's, into Terminus. He does actually have a little bit more synergy with Runeance than Vayne does, so that is an option for a third item. And then you could do either Bork Ginsu's into Terminus, into Runeance, or vice versa with Runeance first, then Terminus. You could even probably, I imagine, just do Terminus instead of Ginsu's. Has a decent win rate, as you can see. You could do Terminus into Runeance. You know, there's a whole lot of choices here. I don't think there's any one build path that is clearly better than the other choices. But you pretty much just always would end up with these 4 items at the very least. And final item, or just to build sooner if you think it's going to be better, you could do Wit's End, you can do GA, you can do Jack Show. Should be pretty good on non-hit ADCs when they just want to stack, or, you know, just build something tanky if they feel their damage is already sufficient. Even Shield Bow, an option as always. And even Titanic Hydra should be quite decent as well, after you have Rune Ends, not before. Next up we have Tristana. Her itemization has not really changed at all. You still want to run Rush Kraken Slayer. Potentially Stormrazor and Static Shiv could also be decent, but Kraken Slayer is the default that everybody goes for. And then second item, it can be either Navori or Infinity Edge. It's possible that Infinity Edge will be better on this patch just because they removed 580 from Navori. They also removed 5% extra crit from Infinity Edge, so it's, you know, not clear cut. Personally, I would probably just still keep running Navori. It just feels better to me, but I haven't played her on this patch, so can't really speak with experience as to this patch. But either way, I mean, both items should be perfectly viable as second item. And then your options for third item, as usual, are Lord Dominik's, Bloodthirster, Fire Cannon. I don't really recommend too much unless you have also Stormrazor or maybe Static Shiv, but it can potentially be viable against, you know, those situations I mentioned where you have that those champions you don't really want to get near, like Vladimir, so you can just poke them from outside of their range. It's not as good on Tristana though as it is on Jinx, because her single auto attacks just don't hurt as much as a Jinx rocket, for example. And Phantom Dancer as well for DPS if we didn't already mention that. For Xayah, very similar build as Tristana, except without the option for Infinity Edge. You can only run Navori on Xayah. And you have the option of doing either Kraken Slayer or Stormrazor, or not many people do it, but Static Shiv should also be perfectly fine as well. I don't think a lot of people would find the wave clear overkill on Xayah, but just having that wave clear spike so much sooner than with the other options is still quite decent in my opinion, and makes these wave clear champions oppressive in the lane phase rather than in the mid game in terms of their wave clear. But regardless of that, Kraken Slayer or whatever your choice is, into Navori. Then third item, your choices, of course, as usual, are Lord Dominik's, Bloodthirster, Phantom Dancer, etc. For Twitch, pretty much probably the only builds that are worth covering are the builds that start with Bork into Rune Ends. There are like alternative build paths you can run, and maybe even some alternative builds that are maybe viable, but I don't think they're really worth covering. You can just always do pretty much Bork into Rune Ends, except for actually one other build I forgot that I was going to mention. We'll cover just in a sec. And then your options are like Infinity Edge, Terminus, Ginsu's in theory, but I don't think that's really worth it anymore compared to the alternatives. You can even do Hexblade, once again, should be quite good on Twitch. Of course, because his Twitch is just like, Twitch Ultimate is obviously also just another big go button. You know, you press ult and you want to do stuff with it. So being at your absolute maximum strength is ideal. In fact, this might actually be best for Twitch, just to abuse his ultimate the best, because it needs attack speed to be effective, because otherwise the shots can miss. And the movement speed to just chase people down or kite even more effectively with it is just going to be amazing, way better than with Ashe. Because Ashe obviously has no trouble usually chasing people down. But being able to permanently stay in range with your ultimate on Twitch when you have enough damage to kill people, that's a scary thought. One thing to note is that I wouldn't actually usually recommend Infinity Edge third item. It's a viable build, it's just not really optimal, because in theory you would just do better with Lord Dominik's third item. Even if the enemies aren't really building armor, it just makes more sense, because Bork has so much damage by itself that doesn't get amplified by crit, but does get amplified by Armor Pen. So Armor Pen as a third item just synergizes better with your Bork, which is already such a strong item that it is worth itemizing around. So then you would ideally then want to do Bork into Rune Ends, into Lord Dominik's, then into Infinity Edge. And of course at this point you would only have one crit item, so it's still, you know, in that sense it doesn't make too much sense to build Infinity Edge yet either. But then also aside from that, there's just the fact that Terminus is like similar to Lord Dominik's, except it's gonna, in that, you know, they both give Armor Pen and Magic Pen, which is good with Bork. Well, not so much the Magic Pen, but it gives Armor Pen, which is good with Bork. But it's going to be a much bigger immediate power spike than Lord Dominik's. The only downside is that it pretty much removes full crit as an option for you if you go Terminus over Lord Dominik's. But in my opinion, it's probably going to turn out to be just by far the biggest power spike, biggest immediate power spike, and so much that the better scaling of the full crit build probably won't really matter in comparison. So I probably would just not really recommend Infinity Edge at all on Twitch at the moment, in comparison to just building Terminus. And then how you would follow that up, I mean, in theory, you can go Terminus into Hexblade, you can do Ginsu's, you can do with Sand, you can do Jack Show, probably is going to be quite strong, or Titanic Hydra. You know, so many different variations are possible here. Pretty much every item I just mentioned, you can mix and match them. So, you know, you can experiment with that. The other thing that I was going to mention, the only other build that I would mention is potentially Bork into Hexblade could be quite good. With you know, delaying the rune ends in favor of Hexblade. The stats that Hexblade gives straight up already just very, very good, so it's really going to help you just stat check people. It's not going to be as good for like 1v9ing teamfights, I don't think, because you're not going to have as much AoE damage, but it's going to be super strong 1v1, super strong for assassinating, so that might actually be worth it. And he has a decent win rate at the moment with Hexblade first item. I don't know if it would actually be better than Bork. Might be an option, maybe something for you to look into. Personally, I would not really recommend it compared to the Bork into Hexblade build path though. Next is Draven. For Draven so far, the most popular build is still just the standard Triforce into Collector, into Bloodthirster. With this build, I've always actually recommended Ravenous Hydra over Bloodthirster, just because it synergized better with his build at the time, where you could get more ability haste, so you can keep your axes up permanently, even without needing to hit minions, which is, I think, a very strong aspect, or a strong quality to have in Draven. Might not be as true now, because now there is an incentive to do Bloodthirster, because you can do Infinity Edge. Seems it's not even popular to do that, but I imagine it should be good. That being said, there's also like one other Draven build that I would possibly recommend, and I think is probably likely to be better at the moment, and that is Youmuu's into Collector. Most people follow that up with Lord Dominic's into more crit, like Infinity Edge. Personally, though, I would actually do a full crit build, but I would probably recommend Essence Reaver instead of Lord Dominic's or Infinity Edge. Lord Dominic's, it can be good if you actually need the armor pen. If the enemies have armor, you would do definitely Lord Dominic's third item, but it's not a core item as third. It's not core to have it third, I mean. Essence Reaver should work quite well with this build and give you like all the mana you need, and yeah, in general it just synergizes quite well with lethality builds. And then you could follow that Essence Reaver up with the Lord Dominic's if you need it, or otherwise Infinity Edge, and then vice versa, you know, whatever. This build should work quite well. You could also probably just not even do full crit if you want, I guess. You could also just do Youmuu's into Collector, into Essence Reaver, into Ravenous Hydra, if you do just want more CDR to have permanent axes. I don't know if that would be better though, but probably you can't really go wrong with both builds, just because this 3-item core at the very least is going to be so strong. Even just this 2-item core, with nothing, you know, with building whatever you want afterwards. This is already going to be quite a solid build, just because Youmuu's and Collector are both so strong at the moment as early items. So for Aphelios, we're actually in one of the rare periods in history right now where we can actually say that Aphelios is quite strong in solo queue. Not even just okay, but actually very, very strong. That is because, as they buffed lethality early on, they didn't actually nerf the lethality on Aphelios' E, so he's just getting a lot more damage out of his E than he used to. I don't know if I would make it worth maxing it first. I tried it once, didn't necessarily feel any better than putting at least like 4 points into Q and then maxing E. But probably, I mean, yeah, I would just play it safe and just max the Q into E. Can't go wrong with that. Maybe it's not like the perfectly optimized skill order, but it should work just fine. No chance of that being bad. And then there's a few different build paths. You can only really run crit on Aphelios, but there's a few different build paths we'll cover. You can rush either Stormrazor or Kraken Slayer generally. Stormrazor is obviously going to give you more survivability. Kraken Slayer gives you more DPS. Could be better against tankier comps. Otherwise, I would probably recommend Stormrazor. Then into Infinity Edge, the only, you know, big crit item that's viable on Aphelios. No more Guild Force. Navori was never viable, so we disregard that. Third item can be, you know, standard situational crit items. Bloodthirster, Lord Dominic's. Potentially even Fire Cannon, not something I usually build, but again, you might find a situation where it could be viable. You could do Phantom Dancer for DPS, particularly paired with Kraken Slayer, would be quite good. Then there's also at least one other build path that I wanted to cover. Oh yeah, Kraken Slayer into Collector, into Infinity Edge, kind of similar to the build we do on Jinx, which was Kraken Slayer into Phantom Dancer, except Aphelios synergizes quite well with Collector, particularly if the enemy comp isn't going to be too tanky, so you don't need too much DPS. This actually gives you a really good mix of like burst and DPS. Having the Kraken Slayer gives you actually both burst and DPS, just because of the way that it interacts with Aphelios' kit, where your ability combos give you a lot of auto attacks naturally. So the Kraken Slayer actually gives you a lot of burst. So these two items synergize quite well with each other in terms of giving you burst, but also a decent amount of DPS in case you need that. And also just giving you a very fast power spike compared to going for the Infinity Edge, which is probably going to be weaker as a second item compared to Collector, while also being more expensive. You would definitely scale better doing the Infinity Edge second, but you can get a faster power spike with Collector, which you may prefer. And then you just obviously follow it up with third item, Infinity Edge, and then whatever else you need. Then there's also just one final build path that I want to cover, which is the most niche of all. That is just Collector into Infinity Edge. This can work if the enemy comp is going to be really, really squishy. Like, the enemy comp is just full of squishies who are, like, none of them are likely to build armor or any kind of survivability at all. It is incredibly niche because you don't usually encounter comps like that. But this build can shine if you encounter a comp like that. It also works really well if you just happen to be extremely fed. If you're extremely fed, it probably actually is the best build. But obviously, because you're building Collector first item, you don't really get much time to determine whether you are going to get extremely fed or not. So it could be seen as a high risk, high reward build. If you're very confident you're going to get fed, you could run this. If you already can tell that you're going to get extremely fed, then you can run this build as well. It's definitely the most niche one, though. I don't recommend it as much, but it does have its place in Aphelios. And honestly, if you haven't even tried it, if you're a big fan of Aphelios and you haven't tried a build like this, I honestly do recommend trying it. It is really fun. Just not always the best build, but it can be quite good. For Sivir, the main items I recommend are just pretty much, just standard crit. Either Kraken Slayer or Static Shiv into Navori. Potentially maybe even Stormrazor can be viable. I've never tried it, but it does give a lot of AD. It could be quite good. Into just like either Lord Dominic's or Phantom Dancer or Bloodthirster. Just, regular situational crit items. A lot of people are not a fan of Static Shiv on Sivir. I mentioned this with Xayah, but the point still applies. They think that it's really overkill with her wave clear. But her wave clear early on is not actually like that insane. She can clear a wave pretty fast, but it costs her a lot of mana and I don't know, like her full W duration. The more wave clear you add onto that, by building Static Shiv, for example, the less mana generally costs you to shove in waves because you much sooner reach a point where you don't need to use Q to shove in the wave. You just only need your W. You'll be able to clear a wave instead of like with 7 autos in the queue. You can do it with 2 autos in the queue, which is very good if you don't have that much time to hit a wave before the enemies start zoning you off of it. So it increases your options to be able to clear a wave in more situations, like where even if you have the raw numbers to be able to clear a wave, you don't have necessarily the opportunity to clear that wave unless you have Static Shiv. And in general, like, it just makes her wave clear so much more oppressive, so much earlier on. So I quite like it. I actually really build Kraken Slayer. I actually have a slightly different way of building Sivir in general. I'm currently, before the reset, I was almost 200 OP in Master with like 60-70% win rate on Sivir. And the build I was using was Static Shiv Rush into either Navori or Collector, either one. Into third item, if I had done Collector, then I always did Navori. But if I'd done Navori, then I would do either Lord Dominic's or Collector, depending on whether I needed Armor Pen or not. And then if I had done Lord Dominic's, then I would always do Collector. And if I had done Collector, then I would always do Lord Dominic's. And this build actually does such absurd Q damage. And final item was always going to be Bloodthirster as well, by the way. And it just does such insane Q damage. I think it's a bit underrated at the moment to play Sivir focusing on her Q more than her W, because it still does insane DPS with how low a cooldown it gets with Navori and your ultimate. And does obviously still insane AoE damage, so long as you can actually get it to hit multiple opponents. And the poke damage is absolutely insane. A squishy on the enemy team is going to take at least half of their HP and damage, potentially even up to 70% of their HP they're going to lose to one single Q if you happen to be ahead and they're behind. But you don't even lose DPS for doing a build like this because you have so much DPS just from your Q itself as well. So it's insane burst, insane poke, insane DPS, or quite good DPS at the very least. So this is why I build Sivir, the way I think is probably the best. It's given me insane results at least. So that might be something you want to try out as well. For Zeri, we have the same crit build that we always have. We have Stormrazor into either Infinity Edge or Navori into Renans. Most people will go with Navori, that's fine. I think Infinity Edge is probably also an option as well, though, if you just want more DPS. And then we also have now a Hexblade build, which seems like some people just run it as like a prelude to just otherwise just a regular crit build. But some people also just do Hexblade into Navori into Titanic Hydra. This one probably does make more sense to me, I guess. Generally, it doesn't feel like an add-on that fits all that well into crit builds, just because crit builds generally typically work best when you're building full crit. But both should be an option. You can really just try it out and see what you think. In theory, it sounds pretty nuts on her. It should be quite good, whether you're building it as first item or whatever. Probably as first item would make the most sense. Not too much to say because we don't have much sample size yet. I haven't done any experimenting, but it should probably be decent on her in one way or another. For Kalista, we just once again have a regular on-hit build. We have Bork into either Terminus or Ginsu's, into either Terminus or Ginsu's, either way works. And then fourth item, we can follow it up with either Runans, or we can just go straight into a tank item, like Jack Show, should be pretty nuts on Kalista as well. It just seems like the best independent tank item to be, like, tacking on to an otherwise fully on-hit build. Just seems quite a good standalone that just gives you a massive amount of tankiness. You could also just do with Sendo if you want. It actually should be quite good on Kalista now in particular, just because it gives 20% tenacity. Kalista, just because she gets countered so hard by slows, and CC in general, should probably be the ADC that benefits the most of this tenacity as well, actually. But yeah, as usual, for any on-hit ADC, you know, so many different choices you have here. You can do Jack Show with Sand, Runans, Shield Bow, GA, even Bloodthirster, I guess. Wouldn't be my first choice, but it should be fine as well. Yeah. For Nilah, just like Samira, we have the same build as always, but just, well, I was going to say new and improved. It's not really new, it's old and improved. Once again, we have the Collector rush. Nilah was already one of the ADCs who was just rushing Collector, even in the previous meta when it was not as strong as it is now. So the fact that it's just massively buffed this patch is very good for her. So you do Collector into Navori, into Immortal Shield Bow, or Bloodthirster, or Phantom Dancer, or Lord Dominic's, you know, a lot of choices there. But mainly Shield Bow would probably be your standard default choice. And that should be a very, very strong build, mainly just because of Collector being so powerful at the moment. For Kog'Maw, once again, we just have regular on-hit builds, so Bork Rush, as always, with on-hit ADCs. Potentially Ginsu is also an option for him, but no reason to overcomplicate it. We'll just say Bork Rush into either Ginsu's or Terminus, into either Terminus or Ginsu's, or potentially Runans as well. For Kog'Maw, I'd actually say probably Terminus second item, especially if you're going to do Runan's third item. It's probably going to be more likely better than Ginsu's. It's probably not as good on the immediate pro spike, but it should scale better just because it gives you so much armor pen and magic pen. You're going to deal a lot of physical damage from Bork and a lot of magic damage from your W. So you actually care a lot about both of these types of penetration. So that should make it really, really, really good on Kog'Maw. You also get that extra tankiness, which, as we know, Kog'Maw is one of the ADCs who has been known to abuse tank items, so getting a little bit of extra tankiness, really good. Should make you a much stronger duelist and just much safer in team fights. But it doesn't matter too much because usually you would just build, you know, both of them back to back, in which case the order doesn't really matter too much, I don't think. But then if you happen to want to build both of these, that's fine, and then you can do Runans as a fourth item. Or potentially you could even just do Jack Show at fourth item if you feel you need that. But Runans is also very, very good on Kog'Maw, because with his high auto attack range, he can apply the bolts onto like really distant targets compared to other ADCs who have lower attack range. Because for whatever reason, the width of the range of Runans scales with your attack range. I don't know why. It's never been mentioned in any tooltip at any point, but it is how it works. So the higher the range of your champion, the wider the range of the Runans, even if you're auto-attacking from low range. At least I think that's how it works. Even if you're auto-attacking from low range, I believe it still uses your max auto-attack range as the like width range determinator. But yeah, so works really well with Kog'Maw, especially by this point where you have so much insane on hit. But you could potentially do a tank item afterwards, and regardless, at this point, if you happen to go with Runans, you have the option of either with Sand. Jack Show is not appearing here, but that's also definitely an option. You can do GA, you can do Titanic Hydra. I would probably not say Kraken Slayer is very needed here. This is just a pure damage item at this point, and this is like the stage of the game where you least just need pure damage. So probably not my recommendation, but I mean, it would work. which is what matters. And then finally we have Senna, who she may have other build choices, particularly with the new items. Maybe some lethality build will pop up, which could actually be better than the conventional crit build. But for Senna ADC, when you're playing her in the farming role, not many people do it, but I think it is a little bit underrated just because these items are so good on her. Stormrazor Rush or Stormrazor Rush or Static Shiv Rush is my recommendation. Both are perfectly fine. Into Fire Cannon third item. This 3-item core is very, very strong. From there on, you can keep on building crit items if you want. You can do Lord Dominic's for anti-tank, or you can do Bloodthirster for lifesteal. It's probably not really necessary to do Bloodthirster though, but just because you're going to get so much lifesteal from building extra crit items. But alternatively, you can also just transition straight into lethality from there. There's not like necessarily any item that I would say is like absolutely core. Mainly just these 3 items are definitely the core 3, and then afterwards it doesn't really make too much difference, I would say, what you build, just as long as it's not a troll item. But anyway, that should about cover, I think, every single ADC and how to build them on patch 14.1. I hope you guys found this helpful. Make sure to like and subscribe for more educational ADC content. We're going to be testing a lot of ADC builds included, a lot of the ones mentioned in this video. So if you guys are excited for that, then I'll see you guys then.